Hey everybody, welcome back to Video Game Esoteric on our long-running series, the Unported playlist, where I take a look at some of my favorite unported arcade games of all time. Today we're taking a look at Ridge Racer 2 from Namco. And I know what you're thinking, Ridge Racer was ported home. The original Ridge Racer was to the PlayStation, but then the franchise forks and we get a evolution of the original Ridge Racer game, Ridge Racer 2, as an arcade exclusive. Before we get too far involved though, do me a huge favor, go down below, hit like, subscribe, and that notification bell definitely helps us out. And if you feel so inclined and want to support the channel, we got a Patreon link down below as well. But Ridge Racer 2 is very similar to the original Ridge Racer. It is just an evolution of the formula. So I'm doing this on a technicality as Unported because you can play a very similar experience on PlayStation 1. But even though they are similar enough, this game has more content and it also looks much better than the PlayStation 1 original. This game blew me away in arcades when I first played it. This and Daytona USA were the two games that proved beyond a shadow of a doubt the graphics in the arcades were hands down better than what we would get on a home console. But when I read in magazines back in the 90s that they were porting Ridge Racer to the original PlayStation, you knew that console meant business because this was a beautiful game in arcades, and if the PlayStation 1 could run it, you knew you were dealing with some awesome hardware. Now, as good as Ridge Racer does look on the PlayStation 1, it is inferior to the arcade version, so you could even kind of consider the arcade version of the original Ridge Racer unported because that experience is unparalleled compared to home ports. But considering that Ridge Racer 2 has even more content and more changes that was never brought to a console, this counts completely. There are stylistic remakes of these on the PlayStation Portable, but it is a different game. The control feels different, so this is truly, in my opinion, unported. You can leave me a comment down below and tell me why I'm wrong. Most people usually do, in a nice way. I don't mind whatsoever. I love chatting with you guys. But back to Ridge Racer and Ridge Racer 2, this is the best racing game ever made that is not called Daytona USA. And I'm sure there's going to be a lot of debate in the comments, but for me, Daytona is just the perfect arcade racing game of the 90s. But Ridge Racer 2 is an incredibly close, almost photo finish second in my heart. If you were lap timing these games against one another, Ridge Racer would finish like 1/10 of a second behind Daytona, if I can be allowed to use that euphemism. This game is near perfection, and it comes down to the handling and control. Now, it's definitely an arcade racing game, so it is unrealistic, but when you get used to how these cars slide around the corner and drift, this game feels like it's an extension of your own hand. You're moving the analog stick or the steering wheel left and right. Everything feels incredible, and you'll see there, it's been like a year since I played this, and I was still able to get first place on the beginner course. That's how much this game naturally just clicks with me. Give it a few laps, you will be drifting around corners, not touching the wall, passing your opponents, near to perfect. Now, as good as the handling and the driving is, we have to talk about just how visually unique and spectacular this game was for when it came out. And even though it looked great on the PlayStation 1, in arcades, it was just running faster, there were more polygons, and the textures were better. And the misnomer is that this is PlayStation 1 hardware because Ridge Racer came to the PlayStation the same way people thought Cruisin' USA in arcades was running on a Nintendo 64 back in the day. And that is not true at all. This is unique hardware that has nothing to do with Sony's platform. This uses Motorola processors and an Evans and Sutherland GPU setup. You've probably never heard of that company before. I've mentioned them previously in videos on Namco, but they were a government contracting sim operator. They basically developed hardware for training simulators, and they got into business in arcades with Namco, and you have the Evans and Sutherland look here, and I think I stuttered there, but I'm just gonna leave it. This looks spectacular. I love that the course changes depending on what different intermediate setting you're playing as. The time is changing. You go from sunset to a nice dark gradient of dusk. There's just so much here. Now, of course, it is still limited because it is just 3 tracks, and they're all using different assets from each other. You'll be racing, 40% of the beginner track on intermediate, and on advanced, you're going to be racing like 60% of track you've seen. But the way they string it together and create racing lines just feels new and fresh, and I love this nighttime scenario as the sides of those canyons light up. It isn't real lighting, of course, it's just a shadow map, and they're basically changing the lighting as you go along. But back when this came out, it seemed incredible. You even get the stars in the sky when this helicopter flies in and around you, and it's all running at a lock 60 frames a second. It's dynamite. But as good as this game looks, it also sounds amazing. The soundtrack is gold. So go ahead and listen for like 45 seconds, and I'll come back and hype Ridge Racer 2 up more, because if you can't tell by now, I love this thing. But enjoy.
1, go! Taking your time, aren't you? What's wrong? Engine trouble? Brilliant driving!
Ridge Racer just has such a classic soundtrack, and these tunes actually went into the sequel to Ridge Racer on the PlayStation. Different game, but it did inherit its soundtrack in parts. Now the question is, why did this stay in arcades? And it's a really easy answer. People had already bought Ridge Racer on the PlayStation 1. It was one of the best-selling launch games around, and it would be really hard for Namco to ask full price for this game to the home market. People would probably not like it too much, and reviewers would probably hit them for regurgitating some content. But in arcades, what happens is, if a game is popular, but the popularity is starting to wane, if they can reuse the board and the cabinet in some way and send upgrade ROMs out, you can create a new game that uses existing assets and add something, and the arcade operator that can then have a game on the floor that is cheaper than buying a new cabinet, and it rejuvenates their profit point. A little arcade history there, but that's why you see these iterative sequels in arcades that never come home, because the home buyer's not going to want to pay 50 bucks for this experience. But again, just ripping around this course, weaving in and out of those hairpin turns, throwing the ass end of the car out and watching it drift around, it just feels perfect. When you're playing Ridge Racer and Ridge Racer 2 well, it has a feel that is unlike any other arcade racing game around. And it's a feel that I miss, because of course we get great racing games now. I mean, the new Forza Horizon just came out at the point of me recording this, and that will tell you how early I record these and make them ahead of time. And while that game is super fun, it just doesn't have the same charm and feel as an arcade racing game. This is a genre I miss. And like I said, I get it. We get plenty of racing games, and they are extremely good and extremely competent, but they all feel like the real-world equivalent of actually driving those vehicles if you owned them. I love games like Ridge Racer. I love games like Daytona. I love games like San Francisco Rush, because they feel so unlike actually driving. They feel more like a video game that has driving in it than a driving video game, if that makes any sense. And if you've never checked this game out, I highly recommend it. It emulates perfectly. I'm in MAME here. You can use an analog, stick. I use the Xbox One X controller. I've tested it with, racing wheels and pedals. You can get any setup running that you want, and it is absolutely spectacular. So however you play this game, if you've never checked it out, you 100% have to play it. And if you have played it, leave me a comment down below and tell me what you think. I'd be curious what your earliest memory of Ridge Racer was, because I remember when this game came out, I was maybe like 9 or 10 years old. I saw it at my local arcade, the Dream Machine. I popped a couple quarters in, and damn did I fall in love with it. 10 out of 10 as a kid. And this game is as good today as it was when it first came out. Of course, the graphics have aged, but I think they've actually aged quite gracefully. This still looks really good, and because it's running at a full 60 frames a second and the control is still perfection, it doesn't really feel like it's aged today. It just happens to have graphics that don't look like graphics that we get with video games in 2021 and 2022. But yeah, that's Ridge Racer 2, a pseudo-sequel, pseudo-enhancement to the original Ridge Racer that was never brought home, and I do consider it probably one of the top 3 best arcade racing games of all time. Like I mentioned earlier, do me a huge favor, go down below, hit like, subscribe, and that notification bell definitely helps us out. I'll be back next Sunday with more Unported playlists and live videos throughout the week as well, but this is one of the best games ever made. Bye-bye.
That was a tough